Hi everyone. I'm just going to start my preamble now so we have plenty of time for this ASLEC ANZ plenary. Uncertainties place the ambiguous regions of environmental arts and culture. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri country and pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge sovereignty over the land and waters was never ceded. Extend my gratitude and thanks to all Indigenous people in the room and part of this conference. It is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name's Jen Hamilton. I'm the current president of ASLEC ANZ, and as I said at the opening, we're so grateful to be part of the ASLEC conference this year and collaborating with such a great organisation. But I wanted to extend my thanks to some folks in ASLEC ANZ who really formed this really neat little team that we got together to do this conference. Sometimes we outsource it to interested parties, and if anyone is interested in a future ASLEC ANZ conference, please come and talk to me. But yeah, to Kim Gordon, Rachel Featherston, Alexis Harley, Kate Judith, Shelley, oh my goodness, I've completely blanked on Shelley's surname. Oh, Shelley's surname's on actually every slide in the building, Shelley Simpson, and as many of you will know, unfortunately not here with us at the moment, but Jess White. Such a fun team to work with. So we came up with this plenary idea together, but there are a few key ideas that tie it together. I guess being an environmental arts organisation and criticism organisation, this question of uncertainty and anxiety and ambiguity about what the future holds is really central to a lot of what we think about. But also, you know, in literary works, in artworks, uncertainty or ambiguity is often at the heart of this creation, and in a lot of environmental thinking that uncertainty or ambiguity is instrumentalised towards particular ends. Thirdly, we're in this moment of like kind of political wildness where so many different issues are coming up in a seemingly urgent way but sitting in awkward relationship to one another. So there's kind of an uncertainty about how to narrate the present moment. And so all three of these things kind of come together in this plenary, and from a range of different perspectives, I'm really grateful to invite the four speakers to share their thoughts, and then we'll have a discussion, hopefully with all of you, about what comes up. So I just want to introduce the four speakers. We did have a fifth speaker, an Indigenous, a local Indigenous educator who pulled out last week, unfortunately, and then I suggested Anawan and Gumbaynggirr artist Gabby Briggs, who's doing a PhD at Monash, and I noticed her name ended up on one of the programs. Gabby's work's amazing, but she isn't here today. She's up on country for NAIDOC week. Okay, so Susan Reid is our first speaker today. Susan is an independent creative researcher interested in multi-being justice and ocean ontologies, who lives and works nomadically on unceded Gadigal and Yugambeh lands, currently affiliated with the University of Sydney as a collaborating researcher on the Extracting the Oceans project. Our second speaker is Hannah McCann, a senior lecturer in cultural studies at the University of Melbourne and DECRA fellow. Hannah's academic work sits within the field of critical femininity studies, and her work appears in journals such as Science, Sexualities and Girlhood Studies, as well as the co-authored book Queer Theory Now, From Foundations to Futures by Bloomsbury. Her non-academic writing is inflected with theory and memoir and has appeared across a range of publications including Overland, Mianjin and Sydney Review of Books. Hannah is a passionate advocate for social justice issues relating to work, gender and sexuality. Our third speaker is Elena Gomez, a poet and PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne, where she's researching Marxist eco-poetics. She's the author of the full-length books Admit the Joyous Passion of Revolt and Body of Work, and several chapbooks and pamphlets. And finally, Astrida Neimanis is Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in Feminist Environmental Humanities at UBC Okanagan on unceded Silk Territories in Kelowna, BC, Canada. Primarily focusing on water, weather and bodies, their research examines environmental and climate justice as feminist questions. So thanks all for coming to this plenary, and I'll just hand over to the speakers to take over. Thank you.
It's a takeover. So, hi everyone. I too acknowledge the Wiradjuri people and their continued connection to these lands and waters, and I offer my respect to elders past and present and acknowledge that no treaty was ever made when these lands were taken, and neither was their compensation, and sovereignty was never ceded. 1. Ocean being. Incredibly beautiful, frightening, and giving, possibly the largest moving phenomena most of us will ever witness. Ocean waters tumble and cascade down ridges, creep abyssal plains, pinch off in crisp eddy rings that coalesce at the surface, rise up in steep shoals and upwellings that crash and fold in on themselves and evaporate into clouds. Ocean currents are not stable or infinite. They have histories and may be shaken, diverted and propelled at different speeds and directions by planetary wobbles, winds, celestial forces and Earth's orbit. Through their global journeys and local upwellings, salty, wet, transitional currents animate the ocean's complex liveliness. Enormous circulatory systems glide, wind and pump their way around the Earth, crossing abyssal plains, massaging continents, breaking off into meandering currents and eddies that deliver warmth and nutrients before cycling back to be replenished. 2. Ocean being. The collective energies of celestial forces, embodied beings and material phenomena thrum indivisibly as ocean. At the poles, melting ice injects fresh into salt waters, and bit by tiny bit their material exchanges draw the millennial thermohaline current across the planet. Forced by the Earth's rotation, the Antarctic circumpolar current sloshes uninterrupted around the South Pole, moving more water per second than all the rivers on the planet combined. The celestial tug of the moon lifts and pulls the ocean across the Earth's surface as one large ripple, while roaring gales stack the seas into crests and troughs. Meandering currents carry rafts of floating microalgae, by-the-wind sailors, ghost nets and garlands of baubled weed. Drifts of their warm filaments break off into eddies that whirl in processions along continental margins. Across the ocean, myriad beings squirm, wriggle, pump and glide together, seabed to surface, entraining sediment particles as they ascend. Searching for food and avoiding predators, these migrators rise under night shelter to the moonlit surface until dawn signals a necessary retreat back to darkness. It's the largest migration of animals on the planet. Powering across the ocean, muscular tuna, orcas and great whites dart and dive for prey. Migrating blues and southern rights pierce the ocean's skin and with their giant whale bodies plunge the depths for food and sonic communion. If lucky, they'll dodge the millions of cargo and fishing ships that also crisscross the seas. Ocean constituencies, all of them, creating, mixing, sounding, moving, and in the case of humans, polluting, draining, and eating the ocean. This is multi-being living with and as ocean. That is, the ocean is more than a life realm, the sum of species biodiversity, a vibrant phenomena, space or fluid. Their local and planetary uniqueness is determined by the physical materiality of watery solutions, planetary forces, diverse, pluri, multi, poly, marine constituencies, sonics, dynamic systems, human waste and extractions, and the relationality of all of these elements. Let me just give this a go. The abyssal ocean is entirely without light, except for the luminous signals emitted by deep-dwelling beings gifted with chemiluminescence. Within abundant darkness, like cold, dark plains punctuated by seamounts, knolls, island arcs, and incised by trenches and valleys, abyssal sonics bend and channel in correspondence with these topographies. Two known energy communities live here. The chemosynthetic ones that feed at the hydrothermal vents, and the detrivores, who are entirely dependent on pulses of nutrition from above. Food packages arrive in the form of carcasses, which take several days to sink through the water column, before landing in a stir of sediment. Nutrition also falls in seasonal rains of detritus that comprise spent phytoplankton and zooplankton from the surface. Falls of organic matter mix with other particulates to form sedimentary compositions of diatom and radiolarian oozes, sponge spicules and clay that vary basin to basin. Beneath dense atmospheres of water, several kilometres deep, lives and lifeways move and transition epocally. Currents creep the abyssal plains, erosion is low, and sedimentation is slow. Some of the deep sea fauna here have direct provenance to the Miocene era, 13 million years ago. Little is understood of this watery archive of material relations and their near and far temporalities and indeterminate futures. Xenophilophores live in these worlds in relation to one another and the materialities of the abyssal depths. Xenos, as I call them, come into lumpy and decorative being by drawing on their mineralised surroundings to create delicate exoskeletons. Their reticulated, heavily folded or fan-shaped forms can also function as nurseries for snailfish. Xenos come into being also through the same mineralised solution of deep ocean waters relied on by manganese nodules, which are also the targeted quarry of multinational deep-sea miners. Xenos and their nodules, or rather xenos and nodules, complicate boundaries delineating minerality with that of biological being. Their mineral kinship blurs distinction between what could reasonably be understood as non-living or living resources for the purposes of international law and extractive regimes and of our own reliances on mineral provisioning. Foregrounding these kinships reminds us that the manganese, copper and lithium that constitute the batteries and household wiring and computers all come to us with their watery worlds. Multi-being, not multi-species. My concept of multi-being acknowledges the material, relational, and temporal dimensions of ocean life and lifeways, offering a decolonising response to the concept of multi-species, which is compromised by its reliance on colonial taxonomising hierarchies of being. The species in multi-species tethers to Linnaean taxonomies and systems of classification which uphold colonial and empirical inheritances that aren't helpful. And if you've ever been relegated to a lower rung by such systems of hierarchical ordering, you know their harms. Multi-being also recognises the related, diverse and ongoing indigenous intellectual, spiritual and cultural concepts and practices of interbeing relations across worlds and lifeways. Although they are by no means exclusionary, I prefer the term multi-being to multi-species. Among other affordances, multi-being accommodates conditions of material embodiment and vulnerability across human and other than human life worlds and ways. In the case of humans, multi-being acknowledges that through our material embodiments, we are rendered materially vulnerable, and that our need to provision materials implicates us all as exceptional predators, albeit differently, with complex issues and violences of extractivism. Thanks very much, everyone.
Not sure if we're good to go. Yeah. Elena, may I introduce you?
Thank you. That was so fascinating to listen to and watch. So thank you for that talk. I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to elders past and present. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And just to describe what I'm going to do now, this is very broad strokes. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that are driving my research in poetic practice and Marxist eco-poetics. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, so I'm sorry for skipping over a lot of things. So I've been thinking lately about what Beverly Best calls capitalism's self-mystifying process and what this means for how we think about the world. As a mode of production based on market exchange, capitalism creates distorted social relations. It also masks them so that objects and people appear in a particular way to us at first glance, insofar as they are always mediated through the totalizing logic of exchange and accumulation. Part of this self-mystification is the illusion of the so-called natural. What may appear as such is the result of capital's concealment. In Best's description of Marxist thought, this is, quote, the contradictory relationship between capitalism's essence and appearance. The work of Marxist analysis is to first expose what is being concealed, to lay bare what capitalism seeks to obscure. An example of this can be found in the historic wages for housework movement and Marxist feminists of the 1970s, where love or domestic work were articulated as forms of unwaged labour integral to the production of value under capitalism. It can also be seen, as Best points out, in Marx's own example of the concepts of freedom and equality as ideas that appear to be central to capitalist relations, but which, quote, are actually in essence the products of the developing relations of exchange in market society. So she uses the example of the so-called freedom to sell your labour on the exchange market of labour, but if you have no choice but to do that, it raises a question of what that freedom actually is. And then to bring things a little bit closer to the themes today, here's one more example. The ubiquity of our reliance on petrochemicals and especially plastics or other technological advancements that require earthly or oceanic resources, which appear as though they have occurred by means of natural advancements, but are in fact largely driven by market forces and colonial expansion. So, why am I beginning a talk about eco-poetry with mystifications in the commodity market, especially since scholars such as Margaret Ronda and Malcolm Ferdinand have highlighted the limits of overemphasizing the economy by many Marxist thinkers? I do this for two reasons. One, to trace a lineage of recent debates in Marxist analysis that have opened up new ways to consider current ecological crises, that is to ask, how does Marx's analysis of the capitalist mode of production reveal the complex and multi-scalar relations between humankind and the earth? and 2, because to think about what is revealed through close attention and what appears in a mystified form is, I think, to also think about poetry. So today I will also turn specifically to poetic form and present it as a mode of making and reading that not only explores these relations in its capacity to contain and rupture the production of knowledge via an aesthetic form, but also by its relation to social movements and historical community-led emancipatory struggles. I may not speak about that as much as I thought I was going to, but it's there. While my research focuses on selected close readings of poems that illuminate these theoretical frameworks, I'm today just taking a broader and slightly more distant survey. Basically, I'm just going to tell you some poetry that does this at the end. With recent Marxist thought, so just to kind of trace some of those debates, John Bellamy Foster has reconstructed the ecological interest within Marx's early writing, focusing on Marx's development of theories of metabolism and his interest in natural sciences. Similarly, Paul Burkett's work in Marx and Nature examines Marx's dialectical method as not only constitutive of the capital-labour relation, but also human and nature relations. Foster and Burkett can each be understood as somewhat foundational to contemporary red-green thought or Marxist ecology, and Foster's concept of the metabolic rift has been a resonant phrase in subsequent Marxist ecological thought. In 2015, Jason Moore's Capitalism and the Web of Life argued a more world systems theory approach to his analysis of capitalism in regards to the natural world. He calls it capitalism in nature. But this has been criticised by Foster, Andreas Malm and others within the left for its departure from key Marxist concepts. If you're interested, there's a lot of this debate playing out there was in the Monthly Review a few years ago. I see this as a productive tension because it forces us to consider the stakes of a position within the details of a broadly leftist and anti-capitalist approach to ecological crisis. It's my contention that an analysis of the structures and processes of capitalism, including wage labour as a commodity, is not, as some argue, a sort of moral placing of humankind above nature, but a description of our social mode as it currently stands. And just to kind of highlight this, I think about times when we notice these ruptures, for example, orcas recently, or other moments that you can think of when nature does something that forces us to reckon with its power. I think the reason that we notice it and are often either delighted or scared of it is because it is showing us something that is not what we normally function as, which is that dominion. So I think, I just want to make that clear that the kind of role of humankind here is not a moral placing. So to recognise the role of humans within the relations of exchange and accumulation allows us to formulate a position from which to address these crises. Ultimately, the debates I've described are disagreements around the characterisation of capital's functions and debates over the centrality and use of Marxist dialectics and his labour theory of value. Maybe not so relevant in some ways, but I think key for that reason that I just said. The development of Marxist ecology responds to Marxist thinkers who did not consider Marx to take environmental concerns seriously, and also to environmental advocates who did not account for the role of capitalism in ecological crises such as climate change and ocean pollution. Recent scholarship focuses less on the tension between ecological and Marxist thought, but instead on other disciplines such as post-colonial theory. For example, Malcolm Ferdinand's decolonial ecology develops a concept not unlike the metabolic rift, but what Ferdinand calls the double fracture, highlighting the fracture that separates, quote, separates the colonial history of the world from its environmental history. Ferdinand, writing from the position of the Caribbean and the Atlantic slave trade, points to, quote, the divide between environmental and ecological movements on the one hand and post-colonial and anti-racist movements on the other. More recently, in Latin America, Theo Riofrancas has written about the tension that arose between the socialist government in power and Indigenous activists over the management of natural resources. My contention is that a Marxist approach to the ecological crises that face us today must take into its consideration the role of historic and ongoing colonial forces in relation to exchange-based commodity markets, and the dialectical relationship between humans and our natural world, or in other words, the concept that we are not only a force that affects nature, but are also affected by it in turn. But Marxist analysis offers a theory of totality that can incorporate the integral role colonialism has played in capitalist development and the role of the land and its resources in the production of value. An example of this is in the colonial expansion of the Americas and rise in precious metal extraction, in the construction of new class forms in pre-revolutionary France, i.e. where did the bourgeoisie get all their money, or the colonisation of the subcontinent by England and the relationship between its takeover of the cotton trade in India and England's Industrial Revolution. So that's that first part. And then to turn to poetry and that idea of self-mystification, let's think about the poem. So the poem is a container that requires of its reader a level of interrogation alongside surrender. As the reader of a poem, we are asked to work it out on some level, while also allowing the poem to show us what it is, i.e. a poem sort of teaches us how to read it, and we are forced on some level to accept it on its terms, or we are at least asked to. To speak about what a poem does is also risky. Poems are a container, but almost uncontainable to talk about in this way. I have a lot of caveats to this, but I'm just going to say it because it will be quicker. But I want to contend that the role of the poem in Marxist ecology is to open up a mode of knowledge production and meaning making that is collaborative between a poet, poem, and reader, and generative through formal techniques that incorporate linguistic play and include other disciplines such as science, history, and other parapoetic forms. So for example, in Mark Nowak's Coal Mountain Elementary, the poem incorporates documentary texts of transcripts, reports of mining disasters in US and China, and propaganda text from peak coal bodies, uniting resource extraction and labour conditions. Claire Marie Stanchek's Mouths comprises lyric poems with experimental techniques that play with sound and linguistic units to complicate human land and water relations and ideas about consumption and history. And Layli Long's Soldiers Whereas opens up the mouth as a site of metabolism for colonial revenge and human-land relations from an Oglala Dakota perspective. And then we have poet activists such as Stephen Collis and Rita Wong, who bring their activist praxis into the compositional method of their poems so that their poetic practice is connected to their communal political action. And Frances Richard, Jenna Osman and Juliana Sparr infuse their poems with different textures of lyrical style alongside histories of colonial sugar trade and multi-scalar aspects of ecology from the chemical plant to the botanical plant and from large-scale human-made structures down to the molecular composition of a substance. Juliana Sparr's poetry in particular connects ecological crisis to military force and imperialism. And just to summarise, because I'm probably gone over time now, poetry's aesthetic and formal qualities allow us to apprehend the complex, current and impending climate crises across different scales and regions, and through a Marxist ecological lens, which I am calling Marxist eco-poetics, allows us to consider solutions that address the role of capitalism via collective action. And I'll stop. Thank you.
Fantastic. So many exciting things. Should I just click this? We'll find out. Is it going to happen? Okay. So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking today and also on which I work. And I'd also like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that the struggle for justice continues. So in my talk today, I want to respond to Jennifer's provocation in the description for this plenary about the potential crossover between reactionary voices on gender and local responses to climate change. And It's my hope that in elucidating some of the enmeshment of these voices, that we might be better placed to critique them. So on one level, the links between the voices on climate and gender when it comes to reactions against kind of left-wing ideas might seem obvious, because there's actors on the right who champion the fossil fuels industry or who deny climate change altogether, which overlaps with those who champion reactionary ideas on the topic of gender. So in an Australian context, we don't have to look very hard to find examples of this, or the publications, the newsprint media that simultaneously spruiks these ideologies. However, digging into the coalition of reactionary voices on gender, the picture becomes a little more confusing. So if we manage to get the slides up, I'll show you an image of anti-trans activist Posey Parker, who you might be familiar with, who led the worldwide tour of the Let Women Speak rally. And, you know, in this image that I'd like to show you, she's pictured with a group of activists where one of the signs behind her reads, "Pinko pro-choice anti-racist leftists say no to gender ideology." So you have these kind of obvious voices like, you know, Malcolm Roberts from One Nation, who are actively denying climate change and then saying they're going to ban the use of pronouns in schools. And then you have people like Posey Parker, who doesn't identify as a feminist, but is kind of collecting these other people with her who do call themselves feminists, who call themselves left-wing, and they're all coming together and coalescing around this issue of anti-trans activism. Okay, so my talk is called A More Manageable Apocalypse. And these are the kind of obvious crossovers that I was talking about. You know, Michael McCormack weighing in on the trans people in sport debate, and simultaneously kind of that week, you know, talking no action on climate. And there's Malcolm Roberts, famously terrible. And there's Posey Parker with her little gaggle of anti-trans activists. So the shared term that's been weaponised by these voices opposing gender diversity and trans rights is a term that they use called gender ideology. And we can understand the emergence of their opposition historically against the context of the rise of a different mobilisation of feminist activists in the past decade, many of whom are intersectional feminists and also connected to the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements, as well as struggles broadly for LGBTQ+ rights. So during this period where these activists, these anti-trans activists have emerged, there's been increasing articulation and media visibility of trans people in their stories and experiences, and there have been legislative wins for LGBTQ+ people, such as marriage equality, but also around gender recognition and birth certificate laws. Now, in the wake of this kind of like progressive, intersectional feminism, and against the visibility of trans people and the legislative gains, there's been this backlash from right-wing evangelicals to fascists to people who call themselves radical feminists, or, as is increasingly the case, they articulate themselves as so-called gender-critical feminists. Now, in its most fascistic formations, backlash has focused on so-called gender ideology as a threat to the nuclear family and thereby the nation state. So, for example, in 2017, far-right Christian protesters gathered in Sao Paulo to protest gender theorist Judith Butler's appearance at a local conference, calling them a witch, burning an effigy of them, and claiming that they were out to corrupt the sexual identities of children. As Butler reflected on this protest, quote, "My sense is that the group who engaged this frenzy of effigy burning, stalking and harassment want to defend Brazil as a place where LGBTQ+ people are not welcome, where the family remains heterosexual, so no gay marriage, where abortion is illegal and reproductive freedom does not exist. They want boys to be boys and girls to be girls, and for there to be no complexity in questions such as this. The effort is anti-feminist, anti-trans, homophobic and nationalist, using social media to stage and disseminate their events. In this way, they resemble the forms of neo-fascism that we see emerging in different parts of the world. And we've also seen this fascistic element more locally, much more recently, in the streets of Melbourne, where neo-Nazis, and this is the fourth image, turned up to the Let Women Speak rally that Posey Parker was running in March this year. And so what we have here is essentially a coalition of seemingly unlikely allies who are all focused on opposing rights for transgender people. Some of these actors describe themselves as feminists, as I've said, usually gender critical. Some are conservative politicians, often evangelical, and some are explicitly fascist. So, for example, in June, a talk was held, so this is like last month, was held at New South Wales Parliament House called "Why Can't Women Talk About Sex?" Speakers included a mix of conservative politicians, activists, and a self-described gender-critical feminist academic, Holly Lawford-Smith, who's at my university. It was hosted by a Liberal Democrat MP and attended by Liberal and Labor MPs. It was broadcast by a new right-wing independent digital media company called ADH TV and promoted via Binary Australia, which is the group who actually ran the No campaign against marriage equality in Australia in 2017, and then when they lost that, they rebranded to focus on anti-trans issues. So here, anti-trans activism is the hinge. When it comes to climate change and environmental issues generally within these coalitions, there is divergence. For the most part, it seems, many of these actors have no stated position on climate issues, or, interestingly, these have fallen away in the wake of their focus on gender, which is definitely a point I will return to shortly. But broadly, some of these actors are climate change skeptics, as I've shown. Others acknowledge climate change and argue for nuclear as the solution. And when it comes to people identifying as radical or gender-critical feminists, some of them are actually nominally environmental activists or have come from this movement. And we've seen this debate happening in the Greens here in Melbourne in a big way. For example, Catherine Deves, who unsuccessfully ran for the Liberal Party in the 2022 federal election, who's part of this kind of coalition against trans rights, she occasionally tweets about nuclear power, and this week it's kind of interesting to see that nukes and trans kids are at the heart of the Liberal Party debates happening at the National Convention. Now, conversely, before pivoting seemingly inexplicably to anti-trans philosophy, Holly Lawford-Smith, who I mentioned before from University of Melbourne, was an environmental philosopher who wrote about the moral duty of individuals to act on climate change. However, tellingly, in Lawford-Smith's 2022 book, Gender Critical Feminism, she outlines, all things relating centrally to women's reproductive role and gender expectations applied on the basis of her being female will be on the feminist agenda as we've outlined it. But climate justice won't be. Climate justice is an everyone issue, not a feminist issue, and that's a good thing, because as I've been arguing, when it becomes feminism's job to smash capitalism and fight climate change, there's a serious risk that feminism simply becomes debilitated by being stretched too thinly, by having too much asked of it. And she also reflects that though she has really cared about issues like climate justice in the past, she's become, so she says, quote, gripped and consumed by gender-critical feminism. Now, I want to get to one more strange and telling example of these coalitions in the USA context before I actually get to my point. And that is, in 2011, Leanne Keith co-founded the group Deep Green Resistance Front. I don't know if anyone's heard of it, DGR. It's a direct action group which calls for a world without industrial civilization for the benefit of the environment. And as their website describes, quote, when civilization ends, the living world will rejoice. We must be biophilic people in order to survive. Now, tellingly, DGR also describes itself as a radical feminist organisation, and in its statement of principles, in these key principles about the environment, it says, gender is not natural, not a choice, and not a feeling. It is a structure of women's oppression. Attempts to create more choices within the sex caste system only serve to reinforce the brutal realities of male power. Now, in 2013, Leanne created and seemingly pivoted to another group, the Women's Liberation Front, WOLF,
Wolf organises predominantly around anti-trans issues with a stated focus on abolishing gender ideology. And despite nominally being in favour of abortion rights, Wolf has received funding from the conservative Christian group Alliance Defending Freedom and have co-organised rallies in the US against trans rights. Now, ADF's main focus is on ending access to abortion and winding back rights for LGBTQ+ people in the US. And I've got some examples of the campaign kind of materials on their websites. As C. Libby explains in their analysis of the links between evangelicals and trans-exclusionary feminists, which sound bizarre, despite their distinct historical and ideological lineages, contemporary evangelical and trans-exclusionary radical feminist positions on trans issues share an effective resonance. Anti-trans rhetoric today positions transgender rights as part of a larger transgender agenda that threatens to endanger women and children and to strip Christians of their civil rights. Now, rather than thinking of these alliances as simply opportunistic coalitions meeting on anti-trans rights, there's something fundamentally shared at the basis of these positions. As we see in the Wolf and ADF examples, children are often placed at the centre of their campaigns as the basis upon which the fight is mounted. And my claim is that what is being conceptually weaponised here, what is fundamentally being fought over, is not the present moment, but the future. The key point that links this to climate change that I'll explain. So first, before we get to that, we can productively turn to queer theorist Lee Edelman, who describes how the figure of the child is often wielded in politics and culture as a symbol of the future, and specifically a future that is founded in the white heterosexual nuclear family. Edelman shows how children are symbolically connected to life and reproductive futurity, while queer people are marked as representing death and no future. And we see this playing out today with constant fear-mongering around the impact of gender ideology on children. We see this in the gender-critical calls to save the tomboy, to stop child transition, and to preserve conversion therapy practices. We see this in the fascist protests that invoke pedophilia and use images of children being harmed by gender ideology at their protests of drag queen storytime events at libraries. We see this in the propaganda of sites like Binary Australia, who state their key aim is protecting children. And we even see this, I find this so fascinating, this is Catherine Deeve's current Twitter profile, who invokes a vision of violence in the name of children. Incredibly, much of the language of these protests directly invokes the old Save Our Children rhetoric seen, for example, in the USA in the 1960s with organised campaigns against gay civil rights, and pictured here is Anita Bryant, the original Posey Parker. Departing from Edelman, what I'd like to point out is that what we're seeing in Australia is not just the invocation of the child as the symbol of the future, but the white female body as the carrier of that child as under threat. Much of this brings up the category of mother as the supreme moral arbiter of what is good and right, what is common sense. So, for example, this recently published piece by Binary Australia uses the language of the stolen generation of Indigenous children in Australia's history, washing it of its specific racist history and transposing it onto a fear about gender ideology of the stolen generation, depicting a white hand against a fence and penned by a mother. In using this title and image, what is called to mind is a kind of white genocide. And when we look at the content of these articles, speeches from conservative politicians and books by gender criticals, what we see is a shared framing of women and children under immense threat. Women's bodies as being colonised and erased, and sex as being eliminated. And while these actors may share nominally different positions on climate change, what is shared is a displacement of fear and uncertainty about the future that is threatened by the shadow of climate change onto a threat against children and women, with the solution founded in the presumed certainty, materiality of the sexed body. Relief from climate apocalypse comes in the name of fabricating a different threat, a war against culture, gender ideology, over nature, the sexed body, specifically white, cisgender women's bodies. As Sophie Lewis and Asa Saracen argue in their 2022 article on the connection between fascism and feminism in today's anti-trans activism, the view of anti-trans activists amounts to what they call an extinction fantasy narrative or apocalyptic intoxication. As Lewis suggests, I suppose what I am claiming is that the millenarian emergency of female erasure, imagined by the slew of TERFs that she kind of names, is an imminent disaster the sisterhood loves, Cassandra like to hate. Very similarly, Libby, who I brought up before, highlights how evangelical pamphlets condemning transgender subjectivity stress moral decay, contagion, and apocalypticism. The reactionary voices in question are fighting for a construction of the future that is certain, where boys are boys and girls are girls, where this is founded in biological guarantee imagined as a concrete and immutable reality. In the meantime, the status quo can continue without having to challenge the logics of capitalist industrial growth, consumption, or emissions. This is not just the logical consequence of the politics of conservative actors in this coalition against gender ideology. In constructing gender-critical feminism as a single-axis politics that rejects so-called burdens of other axes such as race and class or concerns like environmentalism, it cannot help but play ally to the fascistic impulses of its coalition partners, precisely because it purportedly is concerned with nothing other than sex. As Gail Rubin wrote in 1982, when the fear was nuclear war and the battle was the so-called feminist sex wars over pornography and kink, it is precisely at times such as these, when we live with the possibility of unthinkable destruction, that people are likely to become dangerously crazy about sexuality. Disputes over sexual behaviour often become the vehicles for displacing social anxieties and discharging their attendant emotional intensity. Though in this case now it is gender ideology, this idea is suffused with a sense of how the sexual order is under threat. And why sexuality? Because when the future is under threat, as it is now with the very real apocalypse of climate change, reproduction, imagined as the future of the species, becomes an easy latch, a more manageable apocalypse. Thank you.
Okay. Jen, will you tell me when 10 minutes is up? I didn't bring my little clock up, but I'm not going to speak for 10 minutes, more than 10 minutes. Hello, everyone. I am so super grateful to be here on the unceded lands of the One Tree people of the Kulin Nation as an uninvited guest. So I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm not going to give a talk. I have 10 minutes, and I'm going to put some provocations in front of you that strangely, I think, tie together multi-being oceans, Marxist eco-poetics, and gender fascism in ways that I did not anticipate entirely. I'm a professor of gender women's sexuality studies, which I think is important for this context. 3 weeks ago, a grandfather harassed a 9-year-old girl at an elementary school track meet in my small town, screaming that she was not a girl. She had to prove she was a girl, and screamed at her two moms that they should be locked up for gender mutilation. And my small town made the national news. That was just a few weeks ago. Last week, a man walked into a classroom in Waterloo, Ontario, it's another small town, asked, "Is this the gender studies classroom?" and then stabbed the teacher and several students. This is in my country that, again, made the news for these things. So among the many things I thought when these events happened, like very, very recently, one of the things I thought about was how these things are also connected to what I think about planetary breakdown. That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Like, these incidents don't make a lot of sense. And that's part of what I want to talk about today. So, as I said, in lieu of a talk, I want to talk about symptom, feeling, tactics, and power. So these are my 3 provocations. Whoa, I gotta use this. 1, climate crises are not the problem themselves. They are the symptom of deformed and degraded intrahuman power structures and relations that include
cis heteropatriarchy, settler colonialism, and white supremacy. 2, climate change mitigation needs to account for and be mobilized through feeling. And 3, creative practice offers a language and tactics adequate to these crises. So I want to unpack these very briefly, and I will only be able to do so briefly. So on the first one, I think we can agree that cis heteropatriarchy, colonialism, white supremacy are fundamentally about acquisition of resources, property, land, and mastery. Mastery of knowledge, mastery of people, mastery of resources. I think we can hopefully agree that catastrophic climate change is also about acquisition of resources, property, land, mastery, at the expense of, otherwise knowledges and ways of being, multi-being, as Sue referred to. So my idea here, not just mine, of course, is that all of the climate change mitigation strategies in the world will only ever manage the symptoms of these crises. So while, of course, we need environmental, like specifically environmental activism, policies, and laws, sometimes those same laws and policies are used to maintain the status quo of those structures of power. So what I'm trying to think here is how climate crisis is about misogyny, cissexism, racism, colonialism, ableism, ageism. And ironically, although it's these structures of power that have given rise to the way we treat the non-human, multi-being world, also what happens is that when we address climate crisis as such, as an environmental problem, as a climate problem, what we're sometimes doing is maintaining the status quo of those other structures of power. So without, a lot of time to get into it, I'm thinking here, really obvious things like reproductive control, right? Fewer people means less stress on the planet, but, racist settler colonial ideology, right? Or, let's protect nature from people, right? Settler colonialism by, having national parks programs. Or, a famous example in Max Liboiron's book, Pollution is Colonialism, even like picking up litter on beaches assumes settler access to land. So it's like all of these things that we do just in the name of climate don't address those other things. And although sometimes laws and policies are accidentally good for the, good, unless we address those other systems of power, we're not getting at the problem. Okay, so that's provocation 1. 2, climate change mitigation needs to account for and be mobilized through feeling. And what I want to think through here is the idea that sometimes we treat climate change as like a rational or logical problem to be solved through engineering, through science, through these really great things that we do. But, sorry, I'm clicking 2 PowerPoints at the same time. It's kind of too much for my brain. But these power relations are not logical. Like, they're not rational. And here I want to refer to the book that Ghassan Haj wrote some years ago called Is Racism an Environmental Threat? And this book is super interesting on a lot of levels, but like this quote, just the part that I've underlined, I just want to read out because it kind of gets to what I'm trying to encapsulate here. So Ghassan Haj here is talking about, these debates intellectuals have about whether Islamophobia is racism or is it something different. And he says, but if we compare racism and anti-racism across history, we can say that racism has exhibited a far greater malleability than academic anti-racism. Racism has morphed and shown a capacity to target a variety of people, sometimes many at the same time. It efficiently constructs its object, successfully adapting to the dominant modes of classification. I'm thinking here of multi-species as well, Sue. So it adapts to the dominant mode of classification, whether that's phenotypical, biological, cultural, or combination of these or more, comparatively speaking, Academic anti-racism is conceptually ossified, always trying to catch up with racists' fluid mode of classification. Whereas racists happily move from one form of racism to another, caring little about logical contradictions, inconsistencies, and discrepancies, anti-racist academics spend an inordinate amount of time trying to judge racists on these grounds. It is as if the racists' greatest sin is that they are bad thinkers. And I really like this because it sort of is like these structures of power, whether we're talking about racism or transphobia or misogyny, are not rational, like they're not logical. So to try to get at them through logic is not always working. So, if we treat these as rational or logical problems, climate change among them, then we have to understand, or rather, when we treat climate change as something we can just solve through rationality or logical solutions, we have to also understand that these kinds of clinging to power situations are not rational or logical positions. If rationality is what we needed, we wouldn't have climate denialism or turfy transphobes, because those are not rational positions, right? They're not rational. If rationality were what we needed, we wouldn't have to worry about climate change, because we actually have all of the scientific data that shows us what's happening to the planet. We're just not listening to it or using it. This is not a rational position. So if climate change is about power and power is about feeling, climate change mitigation needs to go at it from a place of feeling. That's my second provocation. This is going like from A to like Z in 5 minutes flat. I am no longer interested in winning an argument. This has like been a revelation to me as an academic. I want different tactics. That is not about winning an argument logically. I think that is why we need to turn to poetics, the kind of beautiful ocean multi-being poetics that you offered us as well, Sue. We need these tactics because they can deal in ambiguity and contradiction. We need these tactics because they, and this speaks, I think, very much to what you talked about, Elena, because they are offered from the place of a vulnerable body that, in being vulnerable and porous, invites the porosity and the vulnerability of the other, i.e. they are about finding some kind of fellow feeling in a world where winning arguments rationally seems to have just further entrenched these positions. I think that's all. I think that's 10 minutes, isn't it? Or probably even more. Yeah. I think that these kinds of creative tactics are about love and desire and vulnerability and shame and lust and anger and beauty and all of the other things that make us do the things we do, because we aren't actually that rational. Okay, that's it.
Thanks to the four speakers. Would you like to come up onto the stage for conversation? And in this moment of transition, if you, audience, would like to think of questions or responses, provocations of your own, we have quite a bit of time for that discussion, and we'd like to have it with you. Is there a roaming microphone as well, or should I? We don't need 5.
So one of those can take into the audio share.
Thanks so much, Mark. Keeping it all running. Hello.
just say, you know, listening to your talk, Astrida, like there's a reason why fascists burn books and why they're targeting drag story time and creative things. Like, it's exactly to your point.
Hello. I have a big and potentially provocative, depending on where everyone's situated in this kind of prompt, really, about thinking of, you know, obviously creative affect and emotion as a kind of a theory of change. And there was a book published a couple of years ago on teaching climate change in the humanities. Emily, you're in it, I think, and I think there was an essay in there about you know, poetic kind of emotive work as a theory of change that is, you know, attempted to bridge the action theory gap. And so I understand the logic of that particular kind of emphasis, but the question becomes, you know, how much does the vulnerable need to bleed? Who is vulnerable? Where is this logic of rationality derived from? And who does it privilege and who does it, you know, harm, basically? And I think about as well the Audre Lorde's question or provocation, you know, of the oppressed and the marginal and the vulnerable. You know, I'm invited to speak, but only when I speak my pain. And so I'm wondering to all of you about that kind of privileging logic of who gets to create art and who has to die, basically, and who has to suffer and have art created about them. And so I guess it's a question of the material kinds of functions of poetry and creative practice as a theory of change and as that bridge of the action theory gap.
I can say something. I don't know if I'm going to answer your question, but it's maybe an articulation for myself in thinking about that, which is to sort of centre making and practice as primarily for oneself, and that sort of, the question of separating the making or the practice from the exchange of creative products, because I think the problems that you're speaking to are products of the world as it is and not the form itself, if that makes sense. So I feel like my way of thinking through it is to consider like what it means for someone to make poetry regardless of like the institutions, and like that has limits, but it's sort of my way of kind of thinking about it. That's got a lot of problems in it, I can hear already, but that's one way of thinking.
Yeah, that's such an important provocation, and I'm just trying to like, I guess I'm really interested in tactics right now, primarily, and one of the reasons why I'm interested in looking at what creative practice can do is because I'm, like, as somebody who's been in the Western academic institutions for a couple of decades now, I'm a bit disillusioned with what some of those tactics have not achieved. I also hope that a creative or a poetic tactic wouldn't only be about who has to showcase their pain, but also a way to showcase knowledge and power and joy and love and community and other ways of being that isn't, you know, what the dominant ideal is held up, you know, in so many places. So I think there's like, that it's, I wouldn't want to see it as just a sort of a damage story tactic, but as an alternative way of being tactic, as a sort of a way to bring out the multi-being way of thinking that you were alluding to, Sue, and a way of trying to get through some of the staunch, sort of digging in of heels and wild sort of position taking that we're seeing in some of the things you were talking about, Hannah. So I don't know if I would say that I think it's like the theory of change, but it just feels like a different tactic that needs to be taken more seriously right now. But it's also a provisional answer as I'm still thinking through your question.
I think it's also about how we think about what is creative. And there's the kind of established forms that are, only accessible to some. And that certainly when it comes to telling stories, get kind of funneled into particular frameworks that are going to sell books. I'm thinking of like all the kind of non-binary memoirs that are kind of coming out. I've got a PhD student working on this and how it limits what can be said, in that context, that market context. But we can also look at something like TikTok and the kind of way that people have, this ability to stream their own ideas from their bedroom, and that I wouldn't discount that as creative. It's certainly effective. It's certainly, the internet is a circulation of affects, and the problem there is less people's access or having to tell a particular narrative, but more the kind of algorithmic channels that we fall down where we are in siloed kind of bubbles and we might not access those stories. So yeah, there's a question here about how creative outputs are disseminated.
So I feel a bit lazy because I'm kind of riffing off some comments that I mentioned yesterday. Your question makes me think of the ecologies of practice and what enables us to imagine and what enables us to make things out of what we imagine. The scaffolds of time and space and resources that we need to do those things. The principle being in there, resources, as you would know, in trying to keep a really important journal going as well. And as I said yesterday, and this is coming off a conversation that I had earlier with Astrida, we all need to get really serious about asking the real serious question to those that have access and financial power. I want $1 million. It's really serious. I want $1 million to do my practice, not all to myself, I'm happy to share it. But we need money in order to, live our lives and be sheltered and have the space to practice. And there's been an enormous dismantling of the funding streams in that direction as someone who's been involved in the arts for several decades. The position of artists has declined. So we need to ask, I want $1 million, it's serious, this is what I'm going to do with it.
Yeah, that was great, and I'm going to attempt the impossible of trying to bring you all together and to propose a way or a tactic of feeling. And I want to throw into the conversation the idea of the enclosure of the commons into private property, which is obviously something that Marx critiqued. But we can think of the commons as not just a piece of land, but also, and that's a highly effective relationship between the indigenous people who own land in common and who have relationships with it and who are dispossessed and often came to Australia and then dispossessed the Aboriginal people. Marx touches on that briefly at the end of the first volume of Capital. But this part of why those people were dispossessed, and also some of them were convicts, is because they were poachers. So poaching is an effective way of obviously surviving, but it also still demonstrates the connection to place. And I think one way in which creative practice is so effective and affective is because it enacts a relationship to place. And those places can be the bottom of the sea, and those places, such as the bottom of the sea, are being enclosed into private property for resource extraction. There are also bodies, non-binary, trans, whatever bodies, that are being enclosed into certain private properties about who has the right to speak, who has the right to tell stories about them. So, but poaching and using creative practice can be a way of doing that, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in kind of traditional media. I mean, I've been writing recently about textiles and the way they're used, and basket weaving. These are all ways of using material from country and land as a way of connecting feeling.
Would anyone like to respond? Poaching?
I'll poach $1 million from the university. I don't know. I mean, I don't really know how to respond to your comment, except that, again, I'm just thinking about by whom and from whom and to what end.
Hi. You noted book burning, Hannah. And I wanted to note that the famous picture of Nazis burning books, at the start of the Shoah, is of Magnus Hirschfeld's library, which was a research repository on LGBT people, including trans people. My question for Hannah is the trans body now a non-human body?
I mean, do you want to tell me what you think about that? I'd rather hear from you.
Oh, really? I think in mobilising those affects of disgust and fear, and Judith Butler famously said in Bodies That Matter that bodies that are not considered within the realm of normative gender expression and sex appearance have a certain, less than human. But I'm sort of thinking about those connections you were drawing between, climate skepticism and trans bodies as ways of understanding and organising what counts as human.
Yeah, oh, definitely. And I think part of the argument I was trying to make is that, there's a kind of defeatism in some of these so-called gender-critical feminists who say they used to care about the environment, or maybe they still do. I mean, Holly Lawford-Smith probably doesn't use plastic straws. I have no idea. But, there's a transposition of threat onto, this other body, these other bodies, and marked as culture. This is a cultural fabrication. This isn't truth. This isn't reality. That's how they're constructing this gender ideology notion. And what we need to preserve is nature. I mean, that's what's so interesting, is that this constant reiteration of the idea of the natural body. And meanwhile, nature isn't on the agenda at all.
Or I thought you were going to say, meanwhile, nature is very, very queer and trans. What this idea of what is natural is completely fabricated.
That's true. Yes. I mean, thank you, because we've got Lyle Shelton railing against the gay penguins. And, you're right. I mean, there's so many interesting things around sexuality and gender, and I think I read something about birds that get divorced. this week. But yeah, it's not containable in those binary terms. And that is scary for people.
But I think also just touching on what you're just saying, and what you mentioned, Henry, in your talk, the kind of like fascist history of environmentalism. Like the Nazis were fascists. The Nazis were fascists, and they were also environmentalists. Like that question of the pristine, on the untouched, like it absolutely
and
links.
Purity, right? They were all purity discourses.
Yep, but also like in that kind of almost maybe an iteration of that enclosure idea was like the idea of like the purity relying on keeping out, and like to say only this. And I think the link between, I think that's a really, I think you were sort of saying that, maybe I filled in the blanks, but the link between the fascist kind of environmentalism to anti-trans rhetoric is really clear to me because of that kind of refusal of the acknowledgement of the queer transness of nature itself as we see it. I don't know if that's...
It's about control.
Yeah, control. Yeah.
Hello, I have a question. Thank you all for raising some astonishing questions which are hard to answer. I wondered what you thought about the role of universities in some of these questions about ambiguity and support for the arts, because on the one hand, universities do supply resources and spaces and host conferences like this. On the other hand, they kind of punish creativity, diminish arts and creative spaces, and become interested in their own survival as organisations rather than the teaching, the research and the stuff. I mean, you know, are universities part of the problem or part of the answer? And that's a simplistic way of putting it, but I'd be interested to hear what you have to say on that. Thanks.
I want $1 million.
Two.
Today. Tomorrow another. But that's, you know, seriously, that is also coming from a position of thinking outside of being outside the university. So they are completely compromised on all sorts of levels and shrinking and becoming more brittle in their enablement of creative work. And we seriously need to coalesce outside of them with money.
I was just also going to add to your point the kind of like land theft and property ownership aspect of universities that are like making money from owning the land and buildings. I think they're part of the problem and should be dismantled, but I think that's an ongoing problem that we have to keep going. I don't think there's an easy answer, but I think universities cause more problems than solve. The work that comes out of universities that are good comes from people thinking despite the conditions of the university.
Yeah, that's really provocative, and I think that first of all, I am the university, like I think many of us are. I really am uncomfortable when I talk about the university as though it's something that's not me, because I've worked in universities for, I'm 50 years old, like it's been a while. In one capacity or other, more exploited or less exploited, it's fluctuated, but I am the university. So I really want to own that complicity. I think universities aren't monolithic. I've worked on several continents and many, many different universities. I think there's a lot of good work that can happen despite, that problem, but also give us $1 million, So I think it's just it's become an easy target as well, just to sort of be like, the university is X, and it's the problem, and I'm really interested in how I and other people I know who have I have a permanent position, what can I do to Robin Hood it or Trojan horse it in a different kind of way, because there are a lot of resources there that can be grabbed, and why not by us? Why not? And yes, your point, Elena, my current employer, UBC, their main business is as a property developer. And that's not even hyperbole. They actually are a property developer, and university is kind of their side hustle, in terms of the amount of dollars that circulate and from what and why. So it's like a really serious question that often isn't talked about.
I mean, I want to also add sorry for jumping in. My desire to use the term multi-species also comes out of, as I sort of mentioned in my talk, a sort of discontent with the underlying violences of the term multi-species. And in the university that I have an affiliation with, multi-species is circulated as a concept. And so there's this kind of, in a way, fortressing of the concept as it becomes more and more sedimented as an object that can be monetised. And increasingly, the university is then reluctant to shift from those important concepts, despite pretty good arguments being given for that to happen. So it's kind of interesting, like at a creative level as well, how, yes, there are some affordances through the university, but at the same time, only so far.
Thank you. Thanks for the panel. It's there's a lot here that's very, very interesting. I guess I wanted to ask a question, I suppose, to Astrida, and it's about the relationship between. You talk about, for example, you mentioned Ghassan Haj's point that a lot of forms of racism and racialisation are not that racists happily shift different kinds of justification, that it's not based on logic. And then you made the claim, for example, that we, I presume you mean like humans, are not very rational. And you said that you're more interested now in the mess that we're in, of things at the moment, that you're more interested in tactics. And you suggested that feelings and the elaboration and articulation of feelings by creative practitioners is a way to try to generate, I suppose, a different kind of politics and ethics in the crisis, the myriad crises we're in. But then I guess I wanted to know, what do you see as the relationship between feelings and rationality? Because it seems to me that there is I'm troubled by the dualism that you would seem to have articulated there, I guess. But the other thing is that the concept of feeling itself, I think, is not, it's not a thing, it's not one thing. To give a couple of examples, the elaboration of feeling in the work of Behrouz Boochani, I would say, is quite different from, say, the elaboration of feeling in the Banish Clan thinker Bill Nagy, or indeed the devaluation of feeling in Western metaphysics or coloniality. Okay,
Yeah, wonderful, totally fair points. And thank you for that summary of my talk. I'm just yes, that's exactly what I said. 100% not interested in a false dichotomy between rationality and feeling. I think what I am interested in is taking feeling seriously as a motivator and as an engine of some of the messes we're in. I'm not interested in, so this is a bit of a kind of a tagline I've been using lately, I'm less interested in truth as in the thing that will hold up in a court of law and I made my point and it's logical and therefore I win the argument. And I'm more interested in honesty, this kind of yes, that could be true, but it's not getting us anywhere, So I know that's kind of a fuzzy distinction, and in more time I could maybe elaborate some more examples, but it's yes, maybe the distinction, to take Hodge's example between Islamophobia and racism, you could argue on certain analytical philosophical levels, et cetera, but what is the mess that we're in because of those things? What is the harm that is caused? What are the lives that are lost? How do we address those? So I'm interested in cutting through the kind of bullshit of I'm right because of X that I see so much of. I came out of a philosophical training, in academia, and more of what are we actually looking at here? What is actually motivating us? How can we actually get somewhere that is not just about winning a logical argument? That said, I 100% agree that feeling is really complicated and really diverse and can have a lot more things said about it. I also wanted to, oh shoot, I had a really great wrap-up point and I just forgot what it was. So I won't waste your time. Think about it and tell you that much.
Do we have, I've misplaced my phone. I think it's up on the stage, so I have no idea what time it is. Oh, 1 o'clock. Or maybe we should wrap up there. I like, because it's called Uncertainty's Place. Like, we have no idea what Astrida was going to say to tidy it up. So I'd just like everyone to thank our speakers. Thank you. Thanks for your attention and questions. If you need a moment to kind of just breathe and watch something, we played it in the morning tea, but we're also going to play a film by Perdita Phillips now, and it's 8 minutes, and it'll give you a moment to take stock if you feel that way inclined, or you might feel like running away and getting a sandwich. But Rachel Featherstone's just going to introduce it as you figure out whether or not you're going to stay or leave.
All right, I'll just use this microphone. So obviously, I'm not Perdita Phillips, I'm Rachel Featherstone. So I'm introducing this film on behalf of Perdita, who unfortunately couldn't be at the conference in person. So Perdita Phillips is an environmental artist who has an expansive practice working in installation, environmental projects, walking, sound, video, sculpture and publishing. Recent exhibitions and publications include Bird with Climeart, Bunbury Biennial Culture Nature, Enagaya with John Curtin Gallery, Unique States with Holmes Court Gallery, and Seeping, Maintaining, Flooding and Repairing in Swamp Hen Journal, as well as Fossil 3, a published event. So that's Perdita, and I'm just going to read you an excerpt, or I think it's actually the full abstract for this film, which you can find in the program, but just to give a bit of context. So it's titled Wheatbelt Anticipatory Archive 1. Perdita writes, in February 2023, I was given an unassuming tray of about 6,000 small black and white photographs of farming properties in regional Western Australia. The origin and date of these images are obscure. Taken from a plane, they are an archive made by humans for humans. In what way can the aerial eye of settler colonialism be unsettling into a more ecological vision? Is it possible to create spaces for imagining alternative environmental futures, creating anticipatory archives not already in existence? What happens if an archive is for the future and not just the past? What happens if it speaks forwards as well as backwards and for the more than human? Uncertainty about truth and orientation is at the core of unsettling the present. The artwork is an eco-critical commentary on an accidental regional archive. So Perdita speaking to uncertainty there sort of works quite well after the keynote. So I'll let the film play. It goes for about 8 minutes. Thank you.
Sunday